Caroline Miller. I'm your host for Just Read It. This is a show where Pacific Northwest writers give their takes on the big boys in New York, the New York Times bestseller. Today, we have reversed the process and we have a wonderful writer, Anne Hillerman, who writes the Four Corners mystery saga, Indian sagas with Joe Leaphorn and Chee. Anyway, enough of that. Everybody knows about you, Anne, so welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here with you today, and I'm eager to hear what questions you have for me and to have a conversation.
Well, then let's get right to it, because naturally, as I am a great fan of, first of all, your dad's series, I read all of his, and I've read all of yours. This is you've got a new one coming out. It'll be your sixth in the series or your fifth?
The sixth, that's right.
That's sixth. Okay, I can at least count, Anne. That's something. Okay, well, one of the questions that made me really curious is I noticed you and your husband, who is no longer with us, I'm sorry to say, wrote a lovely book on the landscapes, the backgrounds for your dad's mystery series, Tony Hillerman. And I wondered, your husband was a photographer and a wonderful photographer. Did you, after doing that, was that the seed that made you dare to think you might pick up your dad's popular series?
Yes, it was. It was an interesting process. When my husband and I did that book, I really was not thinking that I would be continuing the series. But my father died right as we were finishing that book. Uh-huh. And so then my husband and I went on a book tour, and we had so much fun. We would go to lots of libraries and community centers all through the Four Corners. And because the book had so many beautiful photos, we would have our projector and show the pictures. And I would, talk about the adventures that we had had driving through the landscape that my father loved. And then I would ask the audience if they had any questions. And inevitably, someone would say, "So, did your dad have another book in the series? Will there be a follow-up to the Chee, Joe Leaphorn stories? Is there something that we can look forward to?" Mm-hmm. And I would have to say, "No, sorry, Dad really used it up before he died." And then I could just really sense the disappointment of the person who'd asked that question. Mm-hmm. And as the tour went on, it dawned on me that I shared that disappointment, and I was going to be missing those characters as much as all of these wonderful fans who'd come to my event were going to miss them. But it also dawned on me that unlike those fans, I knew how to write. And even though I had never written a novel, perhaps I could write a novel that would keep those characters alive. So yeah, in a strange way, doing that nonfiction book really was the bridge that moved me from nonfiction to fiction.
I just had a feeling that that was the case, because there had to be a reason why you would decide, oh yes, I can write my father's mysteries. Well, you were, in all credit, a writer in your own right. But anyway, well, thank you for satisfying that itch. I wanted to know. Now, you've got a new book coming out, the sixth in the series that you have picked up of your own additions to your father's series, and it's called Stargazers. Tell us a little bit about that. That sounds so interesting.
Well, I think I love this book, and I'm so glad that it's going to finally get published in April. Originally, it was scheduled to be published last year in 2020. And the editor and the publisher and I all agreed that it really was better to put it off for a year. And in that time, I had a chance, I think, to make it better. So Stargazer is about it. It's As you mentioned, I'm basically juggling three characters. I have Jim Chee and Joe Leaphorn, whom my father created, and then Bernadette Manuelito, who had been a minor character, who I raised up to be a full-fledged crime solver. So in this book, Bernie Manuelito is the main detective. The book opens with as another law enforcement officer is called to the scene of an unattended death. And it looks like a suicide, but there are a few suspicious things, as any reader of a mystery would expect. The book is set, I try to set all of my mysteries on the Navajo Nation and in places that my father didn't use when he was working on his books. So Stargazer is set on a part of the Navajo reservation called the Alamo Reservation, which is in sort of central New Mexico. And Alamo is near a wonderful astronomy center called the Very Large Array. So it turns out that the man whose body is found is an astronomer who worked at the Very Large Array. So that's one of the stories that's interwoven in Stargazer. And the other story concerns an abandoned house that Bernadette Manuelito goes to. She's looking for someone who owns some cattle that have strayed on the road. And something about this house strikes her as odd. So she knocks and hears noise, and she goes inside, and she finds a woman who's bound and gagged. And then in another room, she finds a dead baby. And I'm not going to say anything else because you have to read this book to find out what happens next.
I'm very excited. Well, you raised so many questions in my mind, but about the book, and I want to talk about Bernadette's introduction. But first, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned earlier your exchange with the people who were responding to wanting more books by your father in the series, kind of hard to do when you're not with us, and how you took up that charge. So it raised a question in my mind. How much do the comments of readers actually influence your development of the characters and your plots?
That is a wonderful question. And that was something, as a first-time novelist, I really had not expected. After my first book, Spider-Woman's Daughter, came out, I got a lot of really interesting comments and fan mail, and some of them were just people saying very nice things, but some of them were people saying, gee, why didn't you do such and such, and why didn't you do so and so, and you've got this wrong, and this person's going east when they should be going west. But I mean, it was fine. I appreciated that people were reading my book so closely.
Yes, so gently. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but the other thing, people would say to me, gee, you had this character, and I really loved him, and I'd like to see more. And they would say, as part of my development of the series, I gave Bernadette Manuelito a little sister. And so many people said, oh, I love that character, but I worry about her. I'm afraid that she's, going to come to harm, or that she's, not going to be able to get her life together. And I really appreciated those comments, and they kind of helped me develop more insight into the characters that I was working with. So, yeah, that was a surprise to me, and a wonderful surprise.
Yes,
and I would say anybody who reads my books who wants to give me a comment, my email is on my website, and I try to answer as many emails as I can, and I really love to hear from fans.
That's wonderful. Wonderful to know that we can have some input. I had another author here, Carolyn Dunn, who also writes mysteries, and she finally had to marry her heroine off because everybody said it's time. So I understand that drive. Well, now we were talking, I want to get into Bernadette because she's so fascinating. But before I do, I want to talk to you again. I'm still with that wonderful book you and your husband did, and those wonderful landscapes. I wonder, elements drive a story. I mean, there's the cultural history of the Indian reservations and the setting and so forth. But do the landscapes interact with your characters? Do they have, I mean, I spent a year there in that area, and they are so dramatic. How do your characters do you take that into account as you develop your characters?
Oh, I certainly do. That's a wonderful question. That question itself is worth a whole interview. In I think it was my third book, Cave of Bones. That is the book where really I think I deal the most with the landscape. Mm-hmm. But part of the whole Navajo spiritual world is that the landscape is sacred, and there are so many sites that have wonderful stories of perseverance and optimism and, how can I say this? Action having consequences. So living in the Southwest, I live in Santa Fe, so it's about maybe a 3-hour drive for me to get to some of the places that I write about. But yes, when I'm developing my stories, I'm always thinking of landscape. And another really wonderful thing about writing about the Southwest is that law enforcement people here, unless they're living in the few urban areas that we have, really have time to be driving through this landscape and appreciating the expansiveness. I think there's something really profound about the link between the human psyche and where we live. And so my characters live in landscapes that are expansive. I think it really helps them think through the issues and the problems and the dilemmas that they're facing. And I think it helps them figure out who did it and why, and kind of move on to the next crime. So did that answer your question?
You did, because as I said, I lived in the Four Corners and drove great expanses, and you had time to feel the landscape. I wondered how that impacted your writing. Well, I've still got a couple of niggly questions about you and your dad. I watched some other interviews to get the scoop on you, and you said that your dad liked hard-boiled mysteries, and that, like, Raymond Chandler was one of his favorite writers. And now your books are rather different. I think you do credit to the tradition. Were there any other writers in your background that influenced your style?
Oh my goodness. I've been a reader all my life, and I have to say, I think anybody who wants to be a writer really has to nurture their talent by reading far and wide. I read a lot of other mysteries. I also read a lot of nonfiction. One of my current favorite writers is William Kent Krueger. I've just finished rereading this sacred land. That's not exactly the right title. I'm sorry. I'll get it right. It's a story that's set during the American Depression about it's sort of a takeoff on the Huckleberry Finn story with some young people who are traveling down the Mississippi River, and their adventures kind of interspersed with the story of America during the late 1920s and early 1930s. Another thing that influenced my writing, and I think this wasn't true so much when my dad was starting his career, is sort of the rise of women detectives. Smart, kind of quirky, but tough and determined to, solve the crime and bring justice to the bad guy. I think the whole sort of universe of those bright, smart women who didn't back down was an influence to me when I thought of I don't want to say taking over, maybe reinvigorating the series that my dad had done so well with for so long. And I knew when I was going to do that, that I was not my dad and that I would need to think of something that would be true to the traditions that he had set, but also give it my own voice. And so that was really how I came up with the idea for taking the character of Bernadette Manuelito, whom he had created as kind of the girlfriend, minor supporting character, and giving her some more responsibility and some more complications, and raising her to be a full-fledged crime solver.
Well, I picked up the comment you had made in another interview, Anne, and I wrote down the quote. I knew I would never be Tony Hillerman, so I needed to make changes. So obviously, Bernadette is one change, and I do want to get into her character, but can you pinpoint some other changes that you felt you had to make?
Yes, I'm a little embarrassed to say this. When I first
an exclusive.
So when I decided that I was going to try my hand at mystery writing, I looked at Dad's characters, and I loved Jim Chee. I think most of Dad's women readers love Jim Chee. But I thought Joe Leaphorn was kind of a tough old guy. And I thought I didn't really feel comfortable with him. He, as you probably remember, was the character that my father began the series with. My dad had written him, in every book except for 3 books. And I was a little intimidated by old Joe. So I thought he has to be in the book, because otherwise Dad's fans will just throw my book in the trash as soon as they open it. So that was one of my first challenges, was figuring out how to deal with the strength of that character in a way that I could as a beginning writer. So that was one change that I made. Joe Leaphorn, who had been pivotal in all of Dad's books, really did not come back as a full-fledged crime solver in my book until The Tale Teller, which was the 5th book in the series. And in that book, something bad happens to Joe in the first book, and he's slowly recovering. So by the time The Tale Teller comes back, he's at full strength again and able to solve the crime. And by that time, I felt a lot more comfortable with him. I'll just say this real quick. The other thing I needed to do, because I was going to make Bernie a full-fledged crime solver, was to give her a backstory. So I created a mother and a sister for her. I developed the place where she and Jim Chee lived since they were married. I had a few more other police officers in the substation where they worked. I think a few things like that were probably the major changes that I made as I took over the series.
Well, I can certainly say, at first I missed Joe. There was something about his crustiness that reminded me of my father, dare I, as long as we're confessing here. But Bernadette is a marvelous addition to the series, and your instinct is right. She's a sandwich generation of sorts. She's in a relatively new marriage, and here is this mother who is aging and more dependent upon her, and this whose sister who is no help at all. So what was your intention? I know you said you felt we needed a woman's point of view. What were you going for when you brought her in? Because I just, I can identify with her so well, and I imagine other women can. Give us a little background on how you created her and why.
Well, there is a very strong tradition in the Navajo culture of women who do things, women who are in charge, women own property, women are basically leaders in the Navajo society. And there also is a strong tradition of women in the armed forces in a lot of Native communities. So it wasn't much of a stretch to come up with a woman character who had those kind of qualities. And one thing that's really been a delight to me when I do talks, say in Farmington or Gallup or Flagstaff, in the towns that are on the edge of the Navajo Nation, often on when I do those talks, there will be Navajo people in the audience. And one of the things that really makes my heart sing is when, say, a Navajo woman, maybe in her 40s, and her daughter, who's maybe in her 20s, and maybe a granddaughter, and maybe even an older Navajo woman will come up to me afterwards, and they'll say how much they like Bernie and how much they are, how they're happy that a series that shows Navajo people in a very strong light is continuing. And then they'll ask if they can take their picture with me. And that always, even if my hair is a mess and I've had a hard day, that always makes me smile.
And if you're a woman, your hair is always a mess, right? It's never picture perfect. Yeah. Well, our time is running out, Anne. I regret that, but I have a singer last question. I won't let you go until I ask this.
Okay.
It takes a lot of courage to take over, as I said, a very popular series and a series of your father, who may have been a little hard-boiled, who knows. But if by some chance fate allowed you to spend an afternoon with him and you were looking at him eyeball to eyeball, what would you say to your father about the changes you had made in his very popular mystery series?
I think the first thing I would say would just be thank you. I mean, I feel so honored to be able to keep these characters alive. And then I would say, I would like have to ask him, so what do you think? Would you have done this?
Very brave of you.
I would love to have had that opportunity. I have to say my mom was still alive for the first 3 books.
Okay.
And I was able to ask her advice. She had been my father's first and probably best editor. And I would not have continued the series if she had any hesitation about it. But she was full of encouragement. And in fact, she was the one who came up with the title for my second book, Rock with Wings. So I think there's a lot of her wonderful energy and support in the series. And I'm enormously grateful for that.
Well, if I know anything about strong men and strong women relationships, your mother's approval probably was a pretty good proxy for your dad. I bet he'd be very proud of what you've done with the series.
Oh,
well,
thank you. Thank you.
Doggone it, we have just eaten up the time. I want to say to my audience that Stargazers will be out, in April, Anne?
April 13th.
April 13th. So all of you go out and buy a copy, and maybe 2 or 3 for friends. And remember Anne's wonderful interview here with us, and give her your support. And thank you so much for this delightful interview. And I hope when you do your next book, you'll consider coming back and spending some time with you. So who knows, maybe Bernadette will have had twins by then. Okay, everyone.
I'm going to tell you, that's part of the mystery.
I know, and that's why we'll keep buying your book. This is Caroline Miller for Just Read It. Consider subscribing to our little series. We come on about every 2 months. and we don't sell ads, we don't sell your name, and you wouldn't want to miss an interview like we had with Anne here today. So Anne, again, thank you, Caroline Miller, for just read it, and see you next time.